Your school probably taught you that the Great Wall of China is visible from space. China's own textbooks taught the same thing, until their first astronaut went up, looked out the window, and couldn't find it. That's the story of Chinese history myths, taught confidently, believed globally, and built on nothing. Most history myths don't appear from nowhere. They have origins: a misread document, a propaganda campaign, a teacher who got it wrong and passed it down. China is particularly interesting because some of the biggest myths about Chinese history weren't invented by outsiders. They were invented by China itself and exported to the world. Today, we're looking at 3 of them: where they started, how they spread, and how much truth, if any, survived. This is Factor Fiction Foundry. Myth 1. The Great Wall is visible from space. Let's start with the one that made it into textbooks. The Great Wall of China can be seen from space. You've heard it. You probably believed it. For decades, so did China. It was printed in their school curriculum as a point of national pride. Here's the problem. It isn't true. At the altitude of the International Space Station, roughly 400 kilometres above Earth, the Great Wall is about as visible as a single human hair viewed from 2 miles away. The wall is, at its widest, around 9 metres across. The human eye simply cannot resolve something that thin at that distance. Physics doesn't allow it. So where did the myth come from? This is the interesting part. The earliest known written claim appears in a 1932 Ripley's Believe It or Not entry. The same column that told you a duck's quack doesn't echo. No source was cited. No measurement was offered. It was simply stated as fact. And because Ripley's had a global readership, it spread. By the time China's space program launched, the myth had been in circulation for 70 years. It was in textbooks, it was in tourist literature, it was a symbol of Chinese ambition. The idea that they'd built something so vast it could be seen from the heavens. Then, in October 2003, China sent its first astronaut into orbit. His name was Yang Liwei, and journalists asked him the obvious question: could he see the wall? He couldn't. China's response was immediate and frankly admirable. By 2004, the claim had been quietly removed from the national curriculum. A government spokesman confirmed the Great Wall cannot be seen from space with the naked eye. The myth had lived for 72 years. It took one honest astronaut to end it. The verdict? Fiction. Completely. But here's what makes it worth examining. China didn't invent this myth out of malice. It was handed to them by a tabloid column. And they adopted it because it was flattering. That's how most myths work. They survive not because they're plausible, but because we want them to be true. That myth was an accident of flattery. The next one is more uncomfortable because it says something about how the West chose to see China and why. Myth 2. China invented gunpowder but only used it for fireworks. Ask most people what China did with gunpowder, and they'll say the same thing. Fireworks, celebrations, festivals. Ask them what happened next, and the story usually goes, the technology spread west. Europeans figure out how to use it in war, and the rest is history. This narrative has a serious problem. It's patronising and it's wrong. China invented gunpowder around the 9th century during the Tang dynasty. That part is accurate. It did begin in alchemist laboratories, where scholars were attempting to produce an elixir of immortality. They mixed saltpeter, sulphur and charcoal and discovered, quite violently, what happened. But within a few generations, the Song dynasty had turned gunpowder into one of the most sophisticated military arsenals the medieval world had ever seen. By the 10th century, Chinese armies were using fire arrows tipped with incendiary gunpowder charges. By the 11th century, they had explosive bombs lobbed from trebuchets. By the 12th century, they had the fire lance, a bamboo tube packed with gunpowder that projected flames, and later shrapnel. This is by most definitions the earliest form of a firearm. China wasn't fumbling with a discovery it didn't understand, it was leading the world in its application. So where did the myth of passive Chinese inventor come from? This is where it gets uncomfortable. Much of the Western narrative around Chinese civilization was shaped during the 18th and 19th centuries, a period of active European imperial expansion into Asia. It was politically convenient to portray China as a civilization that produced great discoveries but lacked the ingenuity to exploit them. That framing justified the idea that Western intervention was somehow a form of progress. The truth is more straightforward. China used gunpowder in warfare for centuries before it reached Europe. By the time Europeans encountered it, they were inheriting a military technology with a 400-year track record. The verdict? Myth. Myth number 3. Marco Polo introduced China to the West. The third myth is perhaps the most delicate, because it isn't fully resolved. There are serious historians on both sides. The story we are taught, Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant, travelled to China in the 13th century, spent 17 years at the court of Kublai Khan, and returned to write an account that gave Europe its first real window into the East. In 1995, a British historian named Francis Wood published a book with a simple title, Did Marco Polo Go to China? Her argument was methodical. Polo's account, Il Million, is remarkably detailed about Central Asia, but when it comes to China itself, it omits the things that any visitor would surely mention. No mention of the Great Wall, which, even then, was an extraordinary structure. No mention of tea, the defining beverage of Chinese civilization. No mention of chopsticks. No mention of foot binding, which was ubiquitous at the time. No mention of the Chinese writing system, despite Polo supposedly spending years in the imperial court. Wood argued that Polo may have been a merchant operating along the Silk Road, gathering accounts from Persian and Arab traders who had been to China, and compiling them into a narrative. His measurements of Chinese cities match Persian sources more closely than Chinese ones. The counter-argument is real. Other scholars note that the Great Wall in Polo's era was not the restored structure we see today. It was largely in ruin, and many routes into China bypassed it entirely. It's possible he simply didn't cross it. So the verdict here is genuinely open. Possible myth? Possibly true. What we can say with confidence is this. Marco Polo's account was not the first European contact with China. It was not independent of other sources, and it almost certainly blended eyewitness observation with second-hand reports. The certainty with which we are taught the story, that's the fiction. 3 myths, 1 debunked by an astronaut, 1 built in imperial convenience, 1 that the historians are still arguing about today. What connects them is something worth holding on to. The confidence with which they were taught. Textbooks printed them, schools repeated them, and most of us never thought to question them, because they sounded authoritative. That's the thing about myths. They don't survive because they're obvious. They survive because we trust the people repeating them. The Great Wall from space? Fiction. And China knows it now. Gunpowder for fireworks? Fiction. China's military was 400 years ahead of anyone. Marco Polo? Still contested, but probably not the clean story you were told. If there's a myth from Chinese history you want me to investigate, or any history for that matter, drop it in the comments. I read every one. And if you want more of this, myths investigated, origins traced, the truth wherever it leads, you know what to do.